Welcome back to CoolCouve. My name is David Benedictus.
And I'm Daria Ruggles. Welcome back.
And today we're going to begin a new series on who are our local heroes and what are they doing for us locally. Our guest today is EricLaBrant, a port commissioner. And welcome, Eric.
Well, good morning.
Hello, Eric. We're so happy to have you with us. You know, the first thing, if we can start with this, is I think a lot of us we know we're a port city, but we don't really understand why the port is important to voters, to citizens and residents, and what do commissioners do?
Well, that's a couple of great questions there. In terms of why the port matters, looking at this year in particular, we read a lot in the news about the kind of what the economy is doing in response to COVID, how things are changing. A lot of folks are really suffering right now financially. And so one of the things that the port is doing right now is to help provide hopefully a little bit of stability in the local economy. Mm-hmm. And we've done that by continuing to operate, continuing to keep cargo moving across the docks. Also working with tenants to make sure that they can keep their doors open and just kind of help hopefully blunt the impact a little bit of the pandemic on our local economy. And I think the net result of that long term is going to be a quicker recovery for Clark County. So that's one of the ways I think in which the port is important. I'll also mention that we had an economic impact study back in 2018 that showed that the port brings about 24,000 jobs to the region.
Wow.
That's about 3,900 jobs within the port and its tenants itself, and then the remainder of those kind of that ripple effect throughout the community. And about 3.8 billion in economic activity generated by the port. So it really, provides a kind of a strong foundation for our regional economy. And in terms of what a commissioner does, we do all sorts of fun stuff. Normally, in a normal year, we'd be doing more in-person meetings with state legislators, with our congressional delegation to talk about policy that's going into effect and how that might influence the local economy. At the federal level, the Columbia River is a federally maintained navigation channel. Mm-hmm. And so we are in constant communication with the Army Corps of Engineers, and again with our congressperson and state senators to talk about what to encourage and promote kind of maintenance of that navigation channel. The Columbia silts up pretty quickly. There's a lot of silt that comes down from the Cascades, and so that has to be dredged pretty much constantly in order to keep it open for ships to navigate. So that's kind of the overview.
How do you go from being a caring community member, a local activist, to an elected official? What was your journey in that? I think that's always interesting to find, how people got started, and what motivated them, what their passion was, and then how they took the step then to become an elected official.
Yeah, it's back in 2014. I think if someone had asked me if I would ever run for office, I mean, there probably were a couple of times there where it came up that I just kind of laughed it off. Because, I suffer from the same, frankly, the same kind of distaste for some of what we see in politics as everyone else. And so I never really saw that initially, but then the port had signed a ground lease to look at building a pretty big rail to marine crude oil terminal. And that would have been about a mile from my house. I had worked in the oil field in the Gulf of Mexico for a couple of years. This was, way back when. And so I had a lot of specific questions around kind of the management and sort of safety around that. Crude oil is really explosive. It's what, and that's not an exaggeration. When unlike say motor oil in your car or something like that, crude oil still has a lot of kind of lighter components mixed in, butane and toluene and hexane, and it's not until it's refined that all of that is kind of separated out into different products. So it's in its raw form, it's pretty explosive, and so you have to be careful with it, just like handling any other explosives. If they were talking about running dynamite through, we probably would want to have ask some questions about how we're going to be safe with that. And I really had some difficulty with getting specific answers to those specific questions. Eventually, it became pretty clear that the proponents of that project were kind of circling the wagons and not really going to tell the community a whole lot. But in Washington State, all of our port commissions are elected, and that gives the opportunity for someone like me, just kind of a nearby resident or someone in the neighborhood, to run for that office and another avenue to get those questions answered. So a lot of folks, a number of kind of friends and acquaintances suggested that I make the run, and finally, finally I went for it. I think it took like 15 for me, with someone saying, you should run for this. Oh, no. So, so it took some encouragement, but I'll say that I've also never felt like I was kind of out on my own doing this. The community really has kind of rallied around what's happening at the port, and for me as a rookie, it was really encouraging to receive that, to have that support. So
Yeah, I have to say that I was one of the people in this, and the thing too, right, Eric? This was Bakken oil from the Bakken region of South Dakota, and that's why it was particularly explosive and toxic. And I know that one of my favorite, most quotable things about Eric, when we were standing side by side as just a couple of neighborhood leaders, speaking truth to power, was when you said, you get the profits, we get the poison. And I was like, who is this guy? So, so, when I think about, there was a time when people had this concept of like civic duty and giving back. And I'm curious how, now that this has shifted into you being a politician, which, to so many people we know is a bad word. Like what is that a bad word to you? And how have things shifted for you in terms of how you were able to respond and behave in the community, and what your perceptions are and how you think you are perceived? Lots of things there, but go ahead and riff on that, Eric.
Well, yeah, I think in a lot of ways the word politician has become kind of a bad word in America.
It's often joined with the word hack. And there's a pejorative term there. I guess that means that they have a narrow view of their responsibility, and that usually points to raising money so they can continue, and that there's some sort of then beholdenness to those powerful corporate entities. That your original passion and energy to support community is subverted or diluted in some way.
My experience, I guess broadly, I would say that right now, it's real easy for folks to get discouraged.
Mm.
And there's certainly nothing more American than petitioning our government for redress of grievances.
Hmm.
So there's, I like to say there's nothing more American than complaining about the government. um, but what's supposed to happen, I think, is that when we complain about things in the government, that the government's supposed to respond to that. It might not always be, in exactly the way that that you or I personally want it, but there's supposed to be kind of a feedback loop there. And right now, I think a lot of folks are feeling like their voices are drowned out by money, and by corporate interests. And that can even, that's me as an individual, that's small business owners versus like larger companies. I as an individual, I can, if I take the time to do it, I can write a letter to a representative, a state representative, or a city council person, or a port commissioner. But when it gets to, certainly when it gets to like the state level or the federal level, I've got that option and I can vote. And that's once every 2 years or 4 years. But, larger companies are able to send lobbyists, and they're able to meet, a lot with their representatives. And unfortunately, I think the result of that is that individuals end up feeling like their opinions don't count.
Mm.
And that's really unfortunate. And some of that, I think, we can do a better job as elected representatives in terms of listening. Some of that, I think, is maybe going to have to be a little more systemic in terms of looking at how do we decrease the influence of money, and especially corporate money, in politics. Because right now it really is sort of a pay to play kind of thing. And that does put politicians in a bad light, because it basically comes down, politicians are the ones kind of accepting that and not changing it. So the other thing that I've noticed is that there's sort of this team versus team, kind of almost like a sports sort of thing happening, where this person supports the red team and that person supports the blue team, and we've got quarterfinals, in the form of primaries, and then we've got kind of like the big finals on election day. But then after that, everyone goes home and ends up representing their fans, so to speak. They represent the people who support them. And I think the job of doing that representation really involves representing your district, representing all the constituents in your district, whether you agree with them or not, whether you vote the way that they would want you to vote or not, obviously isn't going to happen all the time. But really to be thoughtful of what those in opposition, are concerned about and thinking about, and are there ways that you can pay attention to what they need? And that doesn't seem to happen right now. I like to think that in school, if you get 50 or 60% on a test, like that's a failing grade. So if you're only representing 50 or 60% of your constituents, you're failing. And that also means that there's a big chunk of folks in a district at any given time who are going to be feeling unheard, who are going to be feeling like their opinions don't matter. And that's something that I think is on the politicians to change and do a better job of.
Which, you make me think about another aspect, which is the obfuscation of what's good for everyone in terms of public safety. Like the idea that public safety becomes politicized, so that you're in this position of having to balance corporate interests with public safety. Do you find that to be true on the local level?
I think it's so there's a certain element of politics that's kind of a marketing thing, right? You're trying to get out in front of an audience, and get your message across. And it's easier to do that, not necessarily better, but I think it's easier to do that if you can segment that market and really talk to folks who are interested in what you're wanting to talk about. I don't think it's necessarily better. I do think, and have expressed this in other venues as well, I don't think it's necessarily a public safety versus economic prosperity kind of situation. And it's easier to talk about it if we can make it an all or nothing kind of either or proposition. But as I mentioned previously, like between 2014 and 2018, our economic impact as a port went from 2.9 to 3.8 billion. And in that same period of time, we went from 3,200 jobs at the port to 3,900 jobs. So, and almost certainly significant growth since then in both of those numbers. And we've done that without any sacrifice of public safety. We've done that without, we've put in place a fossil fuel prohibition. We've generated an incredible amount of revenue and jobs on wind energy that's being imported. So I don't think, even though there are folks who want to have a jobs versus environment or a jobs versus safety debate, I don't think we even actually have to have that debate to start with. I don't necessarily feel like that's an honest kind of all or nothing alternative. We're making money and making jobs transitioning to renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. I saw in the Columbian that one of the things that sustained the port through our last year with the COVID pandemic was the amount of wind energy products that were coming through, parts that were coming through the port as well. So that diversification seemed to really be a very important and robust economic response to a crisis, to have that.
Yeah, and certainly to give credit where credit is due, that diversification of commodities or of cargoes and also of tenants is something that has been a priority for the port for, I'm sure at least 10 years, probably longer. Business in the port has always been kind of, I call it spiky. You have nothing happening and then a ship comes in and it's expensive to have a ship kind of sitting there at the dock. So you want to get it offloaded as fast as you can and get the ship on its way.
Yeah.
So in a very kind of extreme sense, you're going to have a spike in revenue on that day and then not a whole lot until the next ship comes in. So it's always a challenge to have the more diverse cargo mix that you have, the less of that kind of all or nothing phenomenon that you have. So that's been the case. That are the port staff has been really good at focusing on that, and then also in the strategic plan developed in 2018, we identified the need for a business continuity and resiliency plan. And so for the later part of 2018 and then throughout 2019, the staff was working on developing that and then putting it in place and then practicing it. So tabletop exercises had just wrapped up, I think, in around December 2019. So it was still fresh on everyone's mind. And that preparation and the work that the team put into that really, I think, set us up for success going into that unforeseen pandemic.
So how would you encourage people to stay engaged during this time of people questioning the value, that their voice doesn't matter? It's very hard to feel like you're making an impact. How do people engage with you and the port commissioners, for example? It's in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think there are a number of different ways to kind of connect and get engaged and to start to to influence local policy, my first thought is always, just show up. Um,
Okay.
that's a little tricky during the pandemic, but there are, the Columbian publishes a list of public meetings. I think it's weekly.
Hmm.
Um, but going to those meetings, if you just pull up a chair and kind of listen to what's going on, you'll eventually start to hear things that you might find interesting. Uh, you can in most of those public meetings, there will be some spot for public comment. Um, and if there's something that you have an opinion of, again, this is America. Like, complain to the government. It's written into the Constitution. Um, if there's something that you have questions about or opinions about, speak up. And it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be a prepared speech. Um, Sometimes the kind of the candid remarks that folks have um, are also very valuable. Um, Sitting on the kind of the other side of the desk, I like to say, uh, your voice matters. And I still, like, my hands still get sweaty when I get up to testify at a public public event. Um, I try to be a little more prepared with some notes or some kind of having some talking points to think about. But even then, my mouth gets a little dry, my hands get sweaty, which is the opposite of how it's supposed to be. So I still get nervous. But we're there. We elected representatives are there to listen. That's a big part of the job. It's an important part because that's again that feedback loop that's built into kind of American democracy. But again, whatever you're comfortable with, I'd say show up. I've joked that if you show up and help set up chairs and stack up chairs at the end of meetings, eventually they'll make you the chairperson. Uh,
So, Eric, you were just talking about the other side of the table, and I wanted to ask you, how have your perceptions changed now that you are on the other side of the microphone, so to speak? What your perceptions of what the port is and this process?
um, so in terms of how my perceptions have changed, I've done a lot of learning, and that's been fun. I've gotten to see, kind of more behind the scenes as far as kind of the daily operations of the port. Um, I definitely have a better understanding of the organization and the culture, um, and even I think in some ways a better understanding of how an oil terminal might have seemed like a really good idea at the time, and not not for any nefarious reasons, but just kind of seeing how projects were vetted and how the commission has interacted with the staff. And so I also feel like I've got a good sense of how much elected leaders are supposed to be listening and paying attention, and a better sense of there's a job there to do that involves listening. It also involves sometimes, I think, uh, telling uncomfortable truths honestly and candidly. We don't necessarily always want to talk about, why there are potholes in such and such a road, or why there's some uncomfortable thing happening. But it's also important when stuff like that needs to happen, that our elected representatives are explaining, what's going on. Again, if we're not doing the informing job, it leaves the community feeling just kind of helpless and blindsided, and that's not anything that anyone likes to feel. So.
Can you talk a little bit more, though, because about this idea that that you recognize that it might have seemed like a good idea at the time? Because one of the things that happened was the city was galvanized and against it. So, and I recognize that as opposed to this idea of a politician, that a statesman or an educator or an advocate for something more global in terms of the city's well-being could have these nuances. Can you speak a little bit about why, you know, what aspects of it made you feel like it could have seemed like a good idea at the time?
Yeah, yeah. I think we have a team at the port that is very professional, is very sincere, um, is very sincere about how they engage with customers or potential customers,
Mhm.
um, and really wants to do a really wants to do a good job. And so I think two things in particular have struck me about that as maybe how things might have gone behind the kind of behind the scenes. Again, this is speculation on my part because I wasn't there yet. Um, but I could definitely see how if someone showed up with a proposal for a crude oil terminal that and and certainly what they were talking about in the community, and so I suspect probably we're talking about uh, with the staff as well, is selling this idea that it was going to be clean, that it was going to be modern, that it was going to be safe, um, and also that it would help displace other sources of crude oil that might have a higher carbon impact or that might be in politically contentious kind of parts of the world. And the and so I could see how taken it kind of at face value, that could be it sounds good, it sounds good on the face of it. And we have we have a team of sincere professionals who are used to being fairly transparent and honest about things. So the idea that those might not all be quite the case
Mhm.
um, may not have gotten as much consideration. You know, so that's I think that's part of it. And then there may be a sense the team at the port is really proud of kind of our ability to handle different types of cargo and our ability to do it safely.
Mhm.
And so I think there may have been some sense of, if anyone on the West Coast is going to be able to do a good job at something like that, it would be the Port of Vancouver.
Mhm.
And in that regard, I don't disagree. Um, Whether or not it's a good idea to have that here in Vancouver, um, I don't think so. But in terms of if that happened, would the Port of Vancouver do a good job at it? Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. So,
Is it an oversimplification to say, in regards to what you just said, that Tesoro Savage, the company that was proposing this oil terminal, was actually lying to us then?
um, I again approached it with just kind of some specific questions about how do you handle a commodity that's explosive, that um, releases toxic vapors as it's transferred. Um, it's not to say that it can't be handled safely, uh, but you have to be really cautious about it. Again, it's you're handling explosive commodity. Um, as I continue to ask those specific questions and uh, not get clear answers, my kind of sense of skepticism grew and continued to grow. And
Mhm.
when you're saying you, you you can't transfer crude oil unless you're going through a pipeline, but you can't transfer it from one tank to another, or from a tank to a ship, or a rail car to a tank. You can't transfer it like that without releasing toxic vapors. So really, it's just a question of how do you deal with those? Do you recapture them? Do you burn them? That was kind of the proposal. And like what do you do with it at that point? What's the where does it go? And really, the the plan initially was to burn as much of it as possible down at the port, and then release the exhaust of that burning into the air of Vancouver and Fruit Valley. And there's no getting around that. You're either capturing all of it or not. And the answers to that were, I think, sometimes kind of disingenuous. And that's unfortunate because, again, that contrasts very directly with kind of the honest and I think pretty transparent approach that the port staff is used to taking. So.
Well, and they also had, from what I understand, they had a very poor safety record. So I would hope that when the port looks at these vendors and their propositions and what they're offering, that they're looking at the track record of this particular entity. In this case, from what I understand, they had quite a poor track record for safety.
Yeah, there's definitely some vetting that happens with projects. Thankfully, I think we've really set a new direction in terms of what types of projects we're pursuing. It's, I think an easier kind of process to look at impacts of hauling wind energy components, for example. It's there's still vetting that happens, but in that regard, it's a lot easier. There's not like anything off gassing from a wind turbine or something. So so part of that is just I don't know that we're going to have a whole lot of worrying to do about different types of chemicals, but with bulk commodities, there's still vetting that takes place. We handle copper concentrate, which is, you have to be careful that it doesn't end up in the storm water. Any kind of bulk commodity that the port handles, there's going to be kind of some investigation into that. But yeah, there's definitely, I think, a different direction, and it's not even as much in my mind about rejecting fossil fuels as it is just kind of reading the writing on the wall that time is limited in that kind of in that industry, and there's a transition underway. As we see the proposal from the Biden administration on infrastructure build out and so on, like there are jobs, and again, there are jobs and money to be created in transitioning to renewable energy. And if that's where the business is, if that's where the revenue and the jobs are, then that's simply what we need to be focusing on. That's where we need to focus our effort, and kind of our concentration is on attracting that business. There's an environmental component to that, certainly, but also it's just good business.
I noticed
that good business is also good for the environment, because even the Rockefellers, I mean, the original oil people, are moving away from fossil fuels. And if that isn't telling, I don't know what is.
well,
Saudi Arabia is in the process of transitioning its economy away from oil. They're looking at ways to move more toward being a solar energy kind of powerhouse. So that should send a strong signal to anyone wondering about where the jobs are.
though you see insurance, well, you see a number of corporations, even the Pentagon and big insurance companies, looking at climate change issues and how that's going to impact them long term. And I noticed in the opinion section of the Columbian on March 23rd that the climate action plan that the port had put out. And I was just reading through that. Can you say a little, because that seems to be now you're adopting this policy as a climate action plan, and I'm assuming you're interacting with the state and the Environmental Protection Agency and all those entities in that effort.
Yeah, in 2018, we identified or kind of called out a climate action plan as something that we wanted to pursue.
Mm-hmm.
The port staff has had a sustainability plan in place for, probably 10 plus years. But what the climate action plan in particular allows us to do and gives us a framework to evaluate our greenhouse gas emissions, and then to set some specific goals, and then to kind of have a numerical approach to manage toward those goals, to look at how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions specifically. There's certainly other things that we want to be sustainable about, in terms of whether it's, recycling or moving away from, reducing our paper use, or, whatever the various goals are. Climate change in particular is one that's especially urgent, and I think needs its own specific focus. I think to date, our primary collaboration has actually been with the city of Vancouver, so that we're not kind of reinventing the wheel between our municipality and or between municipalities. So the city of Vancouver has been just really an excellent partner in developing kind of separate climate action plans between the organizations, but related, and ones that I think will dovetail really nicely with one another.
In terms of mission statements and guiding principles, or are you looking like at practical things that you're cooperating on?
I think kind of the gamut. So right now it's being worked on primarily by staff, both at the city and at the port. In terms of guiding principles, I mean, essentially the biggest one is, just to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It's probably not too much more complicated than that. We've had a sustainability program kind of that's a little more overarching in place for a long time, but the climate action plan in particular is really going to be narrowly focused on greenhouse gas emissions. So, and that's I think fairly similar to what the city is doing.
How do you see sort of ordinary people being able to step up the way that you did? Is this something that anyone can do, and you just learn it? Or is your background, has your background made you, I mean, able to do this better than the rest of us?
No, I think in terms of getting involved in this particular kind of way, again, I'd say just, start showing up to meetings, take notes, speak if you feel up to that. If you don't want to speak, hold a sign. If you don't want to hold a sign, make a sign. It's for someone else to hold, whatever you feel comfortable doing. And that's kind of how I got involved, was just kind of showing up to meetings. In my particular case, it was neighborhood association meetings for other neighborhoods, and listening to the questions that people had in the neighborhoods, listening to the responses that they were getting from crude oil terminal proponents, and just kind of taking notes and paying attention. And ultimately, in terms of kind of transitioning to this new role, I would say, if I can do it, anybody can. It's I came in as a total rookie. I'm a full-time bachelor dad, so I'm not wealthy. I didn't have my bachelor's degree even finished yet at that point. So no special education in that regard. It really was just kind of stepping up, like volunteering. I have said in the past, I volunteered to have my name on the signs, but really remembering that it was the community as a whole, I think, that had a lot of questions about things and was really concerned about the issues at the time. But yeah, if I can do it, anybody can, right? If there's something that you're concerned about, start going to meetings, write letters, just kind of pay attention and do whatever you feel comfortable doing. And I think however you're able to get involved matters, you know, and is important. One of the things that I found getting involved and speaking up and you know, sometimes speaking or testifying at public meetings was that as nervous as I was, with sweaty palms and, you know, dry mouth and the whole 9 yards, as nervous as I was, um, and as much as I would personally second guess, you know, is this, did I word this right? Is this the message that I'm supposed to be kind of talking about? As much as I would question myself on that, after speaking up in those meetings, there would be 2 or 3 people, you know, or sometimes more afterward, who would pop up and say, you know, thank you for saying that. That's what I, you know, that's what I was thinking. Uh, so whoever you are, wherever you are, however you're able to contribute or kind of chime in on things, just know that you might be empowering someone else who is also feeling nervous about standing up, or who might have a fear of public speaking or whatever. You know, that you having, whoever you are, wherever you are, having the courage to do those things can empower other people. And you just never know until you jump in and try it. So yeah, it doesn't have to be smooth, it doesn't have to be polished. You know, just speak what's on your mind and what's in your heart.
So you've got the Terminal 1 image behind you. What's I see that every once in a while, before, in the before times when I used to go down and go to the markets down there and things like that, plans for Terminal 1. What's going on with that in the port?
Over my left shoulder here, this building is currently under construction. So if you were to go down there now, you'd see kind of a, depending on the day, you know, last I was down there a few days ago and it was,
This is the old Red Lion, right? That area.
yeah. So the old Red Lion is kind of this building here. The plan for that is to kind of take it apart like a set of Legos, repair the dock that's underneath it, because the dock has been there since it's like 1912 or something. The warehouse on top of it was built in 1923. So those pilings have been in the water for quite a while. And some of them are, you know, are kind of showing their age a little bit. That's, you know, what, 109 years or so. So so those will need to be repaired. Once that dock is repaired, then we'll be taking those kind of those Lego pieces and putting it all back together a little bit bigger than what it currently is, and turning that into something similar to like a Pike Place market, or if you've been to Wenatchee, like a Pybus market. And so actually the Pybus market in Wenatchee is kind of our template that we're sort of keeping in mind for that. This building here is going to be a hotel, and that's currently under construction. And so that's Vesta Hospitality that's building that, and that's going to be a Marriott hotel. And then if we were to rotate the whole thing so that you could see kind of next to the rail berm there, there's a mixed-use development that is currently in the design phase, and we hope to have an agreement in place with that developer here fairly shortly. And that's going to be really exciting. I'm really excited about that. So
Eric, does that going to have some sort of, you know, there's so much talk now about like systemic racism and addressing systemic inequities. Do some of these plans have that focus? Are they looking at all in that, with that lens?
I think there's certainly that consideration happening. What we're looking at in terms of like the Terminal 1 building, for example, is that's going to be public space. And then the other development, I believe, is going to be just straight commercial. So like office space, commercial space, that kind of thing. So I don't know that we're going to have kind of any affordable housing kind of questions come up, or um, systemic kind of questions come up, but that's certainly something that we're keeping in mind. It's also something that we're looking at as a port this year in terms of how, how that affects what we're doing. We're putting together a team or kind of a committee within the port. The port staff, whenever an issue is identified that we want to tackle, um, part of kind of organizational culture at the port is to bring together a committee, kind of like a blue ribbon panel, so to speak, but to bring together a committee to own and tackle a particular issue. That's how the sustainability plan kind of came about. And so that's happening this year with diversity, equity, and inclusion, is figuring out,
Oh, okay.
really looking at what we can do within the port organization itself, what we can do within the community, um, how we can be better partners for community organizations and that kind of thing.
So is this something that you would recommend that people come and show up for? Because one of the things that has sort of been happening in this country is that our public spaces, our the public square, so to speak, has more and more been appropriated by institutions and becomes like industrial parks. And so if you want to, for example, speak out against war or something like that, you are not actually legally able to be in that place because it's owned by a corporation. So in the sense of wanting to keep our port, which, and I do want you to talk about this also, about like how our port is different than other ports in terms of its mission and the way that it's structured. But so would that be an example of people showing up for these meetings to speak up for something like the public square?
That's certainly an option. We have public comment at each of our commission meetings. One of the advantages that the port has, and I guess for the community and having a public port, is that there is public space, and that's something that I think it's also in the strategic plan that we'll be taking a look at, how we manage the public spaces that we have. So we have a trail that goes out toward Frenchman's Bar Park that we've been paving, kind of phased by phase. Um, we don't have any direct ownership or control of Vancouver Lake, but certainly as a close neighbor and as owners of the Flushing Channel, want to take a look at that. So that's an open question. I guess one of the advantages, again, though, of having it be a publicly owned port is that as we look at space on the waterfront, the hotel is not going to be public space per se in terms of a public venue or a park, but the amphitheater that's currently being remodeled will be a public space. The Terminal 1 building will be a public space that'll be overseen, owned, and managed by the port. So there will still be public access for really for a variety of purposes. Ideally, we would want folks to be having a good time there. But if there's if someone has questions or concerns, that's an option. And then again, they're certainly welcome to reach out to the commission, and I definitely encourage that. There are the commission meetings. At the end of each commission meeting, there's a I call it a menu slide that goes up that talks about different ways to interact with the commission. Folks can call into the main port switchboard and leave comments verbally that the commission receives. You can email us. I think there's a contact form on our website. So really just lots of options for however folks feel interested in connecting with and communicating with the commission in particular, because then it's our job to take that community feedback and provide direction to staff based on that. but we very much welcome it, and not just, not just our friends saying good job, but members of the community who have questions or concerns saying, hey, I'm really worried about this, or what's up with this thing I was reading the other day. We welcome that, because it helps us. It helps us ask better questions of the staff, helps us to develop better ideas. I think when we have an idea, and it might seem like a good idea right off the bat, and certainly we have 3 folks on the commission right now that are fairly, I think, fairly well aligned in terms of our values and our goals and so forth. But that also means that we might look at something, and all 3 of us go like, yeah, that seems like a really good idea. It's actually helpful to have someone ask questions, potentially even in opposition, because there might be things that we haven't thought of, and important things. So we developed a fossil fuel or a renewable energy policy that prohibits new fossil fuel projects at the port. And in the development of that policy, I specifically went out of my way to meet with existing fossil fuel tenants that the port has. And I wanted to hear them out. I assumed correctly that they would be concerned, and so I wanted to hear those concerns out. But also, we ended up with a better policy. We ended up with a policy now that allows us to look at biodiesel and renewable diesel projects. Again, assuming those make sense.
Mhm.
But that leaves the door open for us to consider those types of projects, because I think there's a chance that demand may shift in that direction. Well, without talking to the fossil fuel tenants that we have, I wouldn't have known about renewable diesel. I didn't know what that was until talking to them. And so I didn't know if that was an industry buzzword, if that was greenwashing, or if that was like an actual kind of product that we could be proud of. So I was able to learn a lot by talking to someone that I might not necessarily have completely agreed with on other policy. I think if you're a member of the community and you have questions about something, there's value in that for your elected representatives to hear kind of those other perspectives. I think we end up with a better product in the end, a better policy that way.
So it sounds like, instead of us and them, that part of you being a port commissioner is a sense of understanding a greater we, and how we make these decisions, and how we're best informed by them, and how ordinary people can get involved.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go all history nerd, but I think that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do with American democracy ultimately, is to break down this idea of us and them when it comes to folks in power versus folks out of power, frankly, versus the kind of everyday citizens. I think the whole point of how the Constitution is written, how American democracy is structured, is to put power back in the hands of the individual. And certainly we're struggling with that. We have struggled with that. As Barack Obama kind of pointed out, it's like the promised land. We're not there yet. There's a long way to go, but I think we can still be moving in that direction, whether by a little or by a lot. And I think that's at all levels of government. I think it's now a cultural thing in terms of what makes America America, is sort of this idea that the bulk of power should rest with individuals. So then elected representatives really are just servants. You know, our job really is just to make votes on behalf of, you know, and kind of be trustees of that public will, rather than, and I saw it in an RCW, and I should try and find it, but actually, Daria, could we pause and I can look it up real quick? So it's written into, for anyone who's interested, it's RCW 42.30.010. And it says the people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The public insists on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. And it's right there in state law, and I love how it's worded. You know, and I can't really add more to that other than just to say, you know, we're not giving over control to, you know, our elected representatives. We entrust them with decision-making authority on certain things, but ultimately, at the end of the day, that power is still supposed to rest with the public.
They're acting on our behalf.
Acting on our behalf, and I think it's really important and critical for elected representatives to keep that in mind.
So I love that. So that's the RCW, which is the Revised Code of Washington. So, right. So,
yes.
But
we'll link to that too.
yeah. Oh yeah. We'll give people all that stuff at the end. So when we were talking a little bit specifically about the port, Eric, like, so is our port different than other ports? You mentioned it's a public port and we have these elected officials. So how do we differ from other ports, and how does that change the approach to policy?
So there are 75 public ports in the state of Washington, all with elected boards kind of overseeing them. In other states, that's not necessarily the case. The Port of Portland is overseen by 9 commissioners who are all appointed by the governor of Oregon. Then you also have, in some cases, private ports. There's a private terminal here in Vancouver. I believe it's Albina Fuel that runs that, but it's down near the waterfront. The public ports allow people to maintain control of what's going across the docks. And in the history of, like, Seattle, for example, you can see why that would be important. The railroads were in the process of buying up water frontage around Puget Sound so that they could control shipping, you know, over sea. And the longshore and the logging community and the local business community in Seattle realized very quickly that having private corporate control of their waterfront could be disastrous for the local economy. And so I think that's part of why you see that model in Washington specifically.
Wow, thank you. There's so much here. You said you have a hard stop and we don't want to take advantage of your time, but thank you so much. We're obviously going to have to bring you back, Eric, because we still want to know what your future holds, and I guess that'll be our cliffhanger. So thank you so much for joining us today and for your work on our behalf.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate it. And to all of you out there, stay cool and stay curious. We'll be back.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.